Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is part of the Young Scholar webinar series on climate change, macroeconomics and finance, organized by the Axis Forum. So today we're delighted to have Thomas Bourany with us, who will discuss his research on how inequality, trade leakage and policy constraints complicate the design of effective climate agreements and exacerbate non-cooperation and free-riding tendencies. His study asks whether achieving a globally optimal policy with full participation is attainable when countries can exit their climate agreements. Thomas Bourany is a PhD candidate in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. His research agenda lies at the intersection of macroeconomics, climate economics, and international trade, and he studies economic solutions to climate trade, such as carbon taxation and optimally designed climate agreements. So Thomas, you'll have 45 minutes. We'll take clarification questions in the chat. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to present my job market paper, where I'll be talking about the optimal design of climate agreements, inequality, trade, and incentive for carbon policy. So I'm very delighted to share this work with you. And yeah, again, don't hesitate to ask clarifying question along the way. Okay. Oops. So we all know, hopefully here, that fighting climate change requires implementing ambitious carbon reduction policy. And one example would be carbon taxation or carbon pricing that needs to be sufficiently high to imply a reduction of emission. But typically, we see in international agreement a free riding problem that causes climate inaction. The free riding problem comes from the fact that the benefit of fighting climate change are global. So because climate change is a global externality, and so everyone would be incentivized to let the other country do the effort, but the cost of taxation, the cost of carbon taxation, typically are local, and nobody wants to bear the cost of reducing fossil fuel consumption. And this free riding problem, in particular, is also exacerbated because of climate policy redistribution. Indeed, when you're implementing a carbon tax on typically fossil fuel energy, you would have a redistributive effect across countries because different countries have different exposure first to climate. Some countries are hot and cold, through a general equilibrium effect on the fossil fuel markets, and three, on an effect coming through international trade is coming through what we call the leakage effect. Then when you implement a particular tax in one particular country, economic activity tends to be reallocated somewhere else. And so these three effects have winners and losers of carbon taxation, and that's further exacerbate the free riding problem that I was mentioning just before. Okay, and so one proposal against the free riding problem comes from Nordhaus 2015, which highlight the fact that we need to implement trade sanction or carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is typically proposed in the European Union. And trade sanction needs to be typically imposed on non-participants to sustain a climate agreement and to reduce emissions. Okay. And so this proposal for climate clubs, I'm going to look at it through the lens of these different redistributive effects that I was mentioning earlier. And the question I want to ask in this paper is, how can we design a climate agreement that implements the optimal carbon taxation or energy taxation in presence of these inequalities and policy constraints? So that's the question I want to ask. And typically, I'm going to use climate agreement and climate club interchangeably for the first half of the talk, where climate agreement boils down to three things. One would be a carbon tax or carbon price, a level of a carbon tax. Two, a tariff rate from participants of the climate agreement to the non-participant to incentivize them to join potentially. So the tariff rate would be potentially a policy choice. And third, a set of countries that are included in the climate agreement. And so this agreement can be large or more narrow. And so here, by defining the climate agreement like this, we can see the trade-off between an intensive margin and an extensive margin. So typically, like the intensive margin would arise if you would have a climate agreement or a climate club with very small number of countries, but each of them implement a high carbon tax and reduce emission substantially. But on the opposite, you can imagine a larger set of countries, so more extensive climate club, but to accommodate for this set of countries, you would need to potentially reduce, lower the policy, the carbon tax that you want to implement, and reduce the effort that each country implement. And so I'm going to analyze these two margins and the optimal design of the agreement in a climate macro model, or also called the integrated assessment model, with different features. One would be heterogeneity across countries on many different dimensions. I'm going to make clear in a couple of slides, with trade and particularly trade leakage, and strategic implication in the sense that you have a participation constraint where country can endogenously participate or not in the climate agreement. And so this optimal policy design, let me give you a preview of the result. With the complete freedom of the three policy instruments that I was mentioning, the carbon price, the tariff rate, and the choice of countries, the result is that even if you achieve you're maximizing the world welfare, it's impossible to achieve the world optimal policy with complete participation, meaning that you can't achieve a global climate agreement with the first or second best carbon price with all the countries included. In particular, it would be beneficial for everyone to leave several fossil fuel economies, fossil fuel producing countries outside the climate agreement, in particular former Soviet countries. And I'm going to explore also further some of the welfare improvement that have been proposed in the UN COP, in particular the loss and damage funds. If I can take a second to get any clarifying question on the big picture. Otherwise, I'm going to start presenting the integrated assessment model that I was mentioning. Okay. So, as I said, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the literature, but I just wanted to highlight, of course, the original contribution by Nordhaus that's kind of gave this idea of climate club, which is a climate agreement and a trade policy or tariff policy, and some recent paper by Farouki and Laksharipour that explore different trade policies in the context of climate clubs, and how we can potentially result in one potential climate coalition. What I'm going to do in this paper is to search for the optimal climate agreements, so choosing optimally both the carbon tax, the trade policy, and the set of countries, and account for this redistributive effect when the cost of climate change is endogenous to the policy. I'm providing a general framework that can accommodate many extensions that I will talk about at the very end. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the integrated assessment model, which here is going to be shown to be very simple, where I'm abstracting from different dimensions, but keep a lot of heterogeneity across countries. So it's going to be a neoclassical economy, which is going to be deterministic, where different countries in the world are composed, each of them, of 5 agents. And I'm going to go through the 5 agents in turn. The first agent would be a household, and the household is maximizing utility by choosing consumption, and in particular consumption from different countries. So a household in country I will import Cij from country J at price Pj, subject to distance or trade cost, typically modeled as iceberg cost. Potentially subject to tariff that I will talk about in a couple of slides. And the household is going to earn the revenues of the labor that it supplies to the firm, and potentially the energy rent that some other agent, the energy firm, will redistribute. And we'll also have lump sum transfer that could potentially increase the revenue as well. Okay, so the household is very straightforward. That's kind of an example of the Armington model, trade model. So very, very standard. Most of the action will happen on the competitive final good firm, where the final good firms will use different inputs. And so here, the firm will have this production function using labor, using 3 different sorts of energy. And here I'm going to split energy in 3. One would be oil and gas, that I call fossil fuel. Second would be coal. So I know like coal is also a fossil, but here I'm separating coal because it has different features on the energy market. And something I call renewable, which is a composite of all the other non-carbon intensive energy sources that also include like hydro and nuclear, and of course solar and wind. The competitive firm will sell this good at price P, and will different countries, so each firms in each country will be subject to different TFP. The TFP will be composed of 2 terms. One would be some kind of exogenous TFP, which I call ZI here in blue, where some countries are rich and poor because they are more or less productive. And so they're going to produce more or less. This is a composite that could also integrate some institutional differences. And the third, and the second term, which be here, this damage function, and here I'm following this integrated assessment model kind of assumption that the cost of climate change will be coming through this damage function. And so we'll assume that there's some world emission out there that I'm going to specify in one slide, and this world emission will feed back into some damage, so net of damage here function, which could be very small if the cost of climate change is large, and could be closer to 1 if you're close to some kind of optimal temperature. So this damage function will be calibrated very soon in a couple of slides, and will potentially integrate different features of the climate system. Okay, and then an effect of the policy would be potential tax T epsilon for fossil fuel, which would be here again oil and gas and coal in red and in brown. And this carbon tax will increase the cost of energy and potentially change the cost of the goods and the revenue of the household. Okay, so if that is clear, I'm going to go through the other agent of each economy, which would be three energy firms, one for each energy source, and I'm going to talk about the most important, which is the oil and gas producer, which will extract EX, oil and gas from the ground at a convex cost CFVX, and sell this energy input on the international market at price QF. This price is a single price, so here in some sense we'll have free trade in oil and gas on international markets. So some country will be exporter and some country will be importer. It's all going to be determined by the convexity of this and the level of this cost function for fossil fuel. Some country will have a low cost of producing and they will be exporter. Okay. And for the 2 other firms, for coal and renewable, I'm going to make a very stylized assumption to make the model simple. I'm going to assume that each of these energy inputs is traded at the local level, so at the country level. So in each country, you would have a constant return to scale firm that's going to provide this coal and renewable on each different local market, coal and renewable energy, and that because they have constant return to scale is going to be priced at marginal cost, and the supply curve will be elastic. So you can assume that the price here come from this productivity parameter and some input that the firm buys. Okay, to close the model now, we need to know from using fossil fuel, oil and gas and coal, how is that gonna affect emission? And so here I was mentioning before that it comes through this damage function that I'm gonna calibrate in a couple of slides. Okay. If there's no clarifying questions, I'm going to go very quickly on the definition of equilibrium, which is here for a given policy. A competitive equilibrium is a set of decisions where every of the 5 agents that I was mentioning is maximizing either utility or profit, government budget clear, and the price clear, both the energy market and the good market for each good I from each country. So that's the typical Armington assumption. Okay, so now let's go through the main design of the problem that we want to talk about, which is the optimal design of a climate agreement. And so here, the optimal design of a climate agreement will be a combination of 3 things: the set of countries that are included in the climate agreement, a level of a carbon tax, and a tariff. And so the setting is as follows. When country J countries are included in a climate agreement, they pay a carbon tax and potentially reduce carbon emission or fossil fuel consumption. And if country J here exit the climate agreement, the club members impose a uniform tariff on all the countries that are outside the climate agreement, and they impose a tariff of percentage TB on good from the countries outside. And so they still trade with the club members on oil and gas at competitive price QF, but they impose a tariff that the household, in some sense, following recent debate about trade policy, the household has to, of country I, has to pay on good coming from country J. So here we'll consider like Nash equilibria, where each country can make the choice or not to unilaterally to join or not, or to exit the climate agreement. And so that will kind of create some kind of participation constraint or policy constraint that's at the heart of the free riding problem, where a country can choose, say the government of each country can choose to leave the climate agreement. And so now the new climate agreement would be the same as before without this country I that's leaving. And so this participation constraint will make sure that the country would join only if the utility of their representative consumer is higher in the club than outside the club. So this participation constraint will put some kind of bound on the amount or on the different policy instruments that are implemented in the climate agreement. Okay, so subject to this participation constraint, the problem I want to look at is the optimal design of this climate agreement. So choosing both the set of countries and the policy instrument, maximizing the world welfare, which would be the weighted sum of the utilities of the different consumers of each country. So here you assume that you have different Pareto weight for different countries. So you have some kind of general assembly of some meta union that's imposing a climate agreement on its member J and choosing the instrument T epsilon and TB for carbon tax and tariff for non-members. But the optimal design here would be to maximize the world welfare. So here I'm optimizing over the sum of all the countries in the world. We are trying not to create some kind of ivory tower where a few set of countries maximize their own benefit. Here we are interested in solving climate change, and so we are interested in solving a global problem, and so we are maximizing the global utility or global welfare. And I was mentioning that's subject to participation constraint. So that's creates some kind of stability issue that some country can exit if they don't find it profitable. Okay, So that was the most important slide for the design of the setting. For the interest of time, I'm going to skip some kind of technical definition of other equilibria, some correlational Nash equilibria, and some solution method. But if you are interested, we can talk about that later offline. Okay, so one of the contributions of this paper is to design this optimal climate agreement and to provide policy recommendation for the real world, and to match this model with the real world. I'm quantifying some of the functional forms of the functions that I use in the model. So here I'm going to go very quickly on this, but I'm using an isoelastic cost function, which would be summarized with level and the curvature for the convex cost of extracting fossil fuel, so creating again exporters and importers of fossil fuel. The Harmington model will be very standard. I'm matching the import shares of different countries to reproduce the N by N trade flows, bilateral trade flows using iceberg cost and preferences. For the production function, I'm using nested CS between capital labor and capital I didn't mention, but basically labor and energy with a nest first on capital labor and energy, and then between energy, different energy source with elasticity sigma E. I'm matching TFP and directed technical change to calibrate the energy shares of each country and the GDP. Okay, for the Pareto weight, which is going to be important, I'm going to shut down some redistribution motif in the current equilibrium we live in. In particular, we are not going to use the climate agreement to solve world inequality problem. We are taking the world as it is today with its inequality, and we are trying to fight climate externality. And so we are not using carbon taxation to do some kind of terms of trade manipulation or some kind of transfers. And so for that, we use what we call Negishi weight or a Pareto weight that make the current competitive equilibrium efficient under this weight. And so these weights end up being proportional to the ratio, to the inverse of the marginal utility. Okay, so last thing for the quantification, I'm calibrating a climate system where I'm assuming that the economic model is providing an energy variable, EF and EC, once and for all. So I'm considering a static model where when you choose these levels, this level will be the yearly emissions or the yearly fossil fuel consumption for the rest of, say, the next century. And so this emission will be constant and will feed into the atmosphere. And I'm going to consider some simple dynamic system where you have some cumulative carbon emission in the atmosphere due to this greenhouse gas emission, subject to a very small, almost zero decay of the carbon in the atmosphere, and a constant or linear pattern scaling from the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere onto the temperature of each country I. So here, the local temperature could be dynamic and will change with the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And with that, we're going to consider a yearly or period damage function that could be heterogeneous across countries. And here I'm going to follow the literature and take a Nordhaus function, which is quadratic, and do a present discounted value of the future damages to account for all the future damages of climate change in the next century, and express them as a present discounted value, subject to some discount rate rho, to some present damage function. So this might sound a little bit complicated to do a dynamic model, but it ends up being a very well-defined damage function that would depend on only one single variable, which is the total stock of emission that's released in the atmosphere. And so we can see that we can express today we are at 10 gigaton per year of emission. So that's the right-hand side here. And if we are reducing emission, the productivity increase, meaning that the damage would decrease, the damage of climate change would decrease. And that cost would be heterogeneous across countries. In particular, would be potentially larger for India. The damage of climate change would be larger for India because it's warmer, or Southeast Asia, or sub-Saharan countries. And the cost for cold countries, say Canada and Russia, would be different. Okay, so I spent a bit too much time on this, but I'm gonna do a quantitative application where I'm matching the model with 10 regions that are listed here. It's work in progress. Hopefully in the next few months, I'm gonna have a panel of 25 countries, typically the G20 plus some extra large countries. But I'm matching the data which are averaged across the last few years and matching all the variables that we care about, typically GDP per capita, temperature, and the oil and gas production. Okay. Before going to the result for the optimal design of the climate agreement, we need to ask what are the policy benchmark when we don't have the free riding problem, when we don't have endogenous participation. Assume that the entire world is getting together and maximizing global welfare. What would be the carbon tax? And so here I'm going to do like a summary of this other paper that I have related to the optimal policy without endogenous participation, where I'm showing that the level of the carbon taxation depends crucially on the availability of the redistribution instrument. As I was mentioning, carbon taxation has redistributive effect, and potentially carbon taxation needs to account for this. And let me go through the argument here. Okay, so let's consider the first best allocation, where a social planner has access to unlimited instrument, in particular cross-country transfers. We end up with the standard result in the representative agent economy, Nordhaus or Golosov, Krussel, Hassler, and Tivinsky's paper in Econometrica. The carbon tax is equal to the social cost of carbon, something that's very well known in the literature. But in the background, to offset some of the redistributive effects of carbon taxation between different countries on energy market, you need to rely on these cross-country transfers. You need to pay to tax lump sum some countries, say the US or fossil fuel producer, and or fossil fuel consumer mainly, and transfer to the countries that are affected more by climate change. And these cross-country transfer, you don't really see them in practice. You see development aid, but like the amount of transfer that is needed in the this common class of model is typically really large. And so what I'm showing in this paper is that in the second best, when you're assuming that the social planner maximize welfare but have access only to a single carbon tax without transfers, the social planner need to account for this redistributive effect. Typically, it needs to account for inequality, so differences in consumption or marginal utility of consumption across countries, or some general equilibrium on the energy market, and so that's what's going to be shown in this formula by these two terms, and also a trade leakage. So let me go through the formula. So the level of the carbon tax, the optimal carbon tax for a world social planner, would be the weighted sum of the local cost of carbon, which is typically summarizing the marginal cost of climate change for each country I. But not only the social cost of carbon needs to be included in the carbon tax, but also, and that's a result from public finance, you need to account for this demand and supply elasticities when you're setting the tax. And so when you're imposing a carbon tax, you're going to typically reduce the energy rent of some fossil fuel producer, and so you need to account for that. And when you're putting a tax, this is distortive, and so you're going to affect the demand for each countries, and you need to account for that when you set up the carbon tax. Each of these demand distortion and supply distortion and the local cost of carbon needs to be weighted with a parameter phi here, which relates to, of course, the Pareto weight. If you like this country a lot or not, you're gonna change the level of the tax. but also the marginal utility of consumption, which is some kind of representation of the inequality in income. And a term here which is hard to define, but it's Lagrange multipliers of the market clearing for the good I. So here we have a trade model, and so we know that this trade producing country I need to be supplied in different countries. So maybe you don't want to shrink the economy of country I if you know that this country I is providing goods to the rest of the world. Okay, so this is a very short summary of this one paper, but the main formula is the following. And so here I'm going to use this result because I'm going to show that the level of the carbon tax need to be different if you're in the first best or in the second best. If you're in the second best, typically the level of the carbon tax will be lower because it accounts for inequality. You don't want to damage the energy rent or the economies, the energy use, or the energy demand of different countries, and typically the tax will be lower than the social cost of carbon. Okay. And the third policy benchmark, which is also looked in different papers of the literature, is the unilateral policy when you choose each country use in a Nash equilibrium its own trade policy. So here I'm not going to talk too much about it because it's been explored in many other papers in the literature, but I'm going to show you a numerical result for the second best and then imposing endogenous participation to see how this changes. Okay, so let's imagine that we have the entire world in a climate agreement without participation constraint. What would be the welfare gains and potentially the winners and losers of this optimal carbon tax? And here I'm going to talk about the second best, where I'm choosing the optimal carbon tax without transfers. Okay, and so here the optimal carbon tax will be $136 per ton of CO2. It's slightly lower than the result I have in the first best, which is typically 150 or 160. So it's like 20% smaller than the social cost of carbon. It reduces fossil fuel consumption and CO2 emission by 40% compared to the competitive equilibrium, where no country imposes a carbon tax. And so here we see the welfare differences for different countries. So we have 10 regions I was mentioning: the US, China, European Union, South Asia, which is India and other South Asian countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Russia, a region I call Advanced Asia, which has Japan, Korea, and also Australia, because they have the same level of GDP per capita. Southeast Asia, which is much warmer, and Latin America. Okay, so we see that the big winners of carbon taxation are the countries that are affected the most by climate change: South Asia, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The countries that are losing are Russia and former Soviet countries that are typically cold and producing fossil fuel. Middle East is also affected negatively by this tax on fossil fuel, but it's gaining on the reduction in the climate externality. China is using a lot of coal, so it's not winning too much from the optimal carbon tax. Okay, so that's for the World Social Planner, and we see already the different incentives of the different countries. And now, in the next slides, we're gonna talk about bringing in the participation constraint, the endogenous participation. Okay, and so I'm going to make the point here in that slide that the cost of participation and being in or out the climate agreement depend on two margins. One would be the cost of taxation, or the distortionary cost of taxation, which brings a gain from deviating and a gain from trade. Let me go through the first one first. So the cost of taxation can be summarized by the gain from each country. If every country in the world is imposing this level of carbon tax, if all the countries in the world impose this level of carbon tax, what's the gain for each of these countries to leave a climate agreement unilaterally? That's what I call the gains from unilateral exit from the agreement. So it's some kind of measure of the free riding incentive. And you see that here it could be very heterogeneous across countries. The European Union have some gains of stopping climate change, and doesn't have too much gain from deviating, while Middle East, former Soviet countries, and potentially poor developing economies like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have a lot of gain from unilaterally deviating from a climate agreement. And so this free riding incentive, as I was mentioning, is different for different countries and needs to be put into comparison with the gain from trade. Let me take a step back. I was mentioning that the climate agreement would be a carbon tax and also a tariff on countries that potentially deviate. The gain from trade is a summary measure of the cost from autarky. So suppose you're putting a country I in autarky. So suppose everyone is in the club and everyone is imposing a tariff on country I. What would be the gain from trade or the loss from autarky, which we call sometimes the gain from trade? Okay, so suppose everyone is in the club and impose a tariff on, say, Advanced Asia, Southeast Asia, and any of these countries. Typically, these countries have a large cost of autarky because they trade a lot with their trade partner in other countries in Asia. And typically, they trade a lot with each other and they trade a lot with China, which is also why China has a large cost from autarky. Some other countries like Russia and former Soviet countries or the Middle East are not trading that much with other trade partners, and the gain from trade is relatively small. See, that's also the case for the US, which is a relatively more closed economy. And so here we see that we have, in comparison on the same axis, the gain from unilaterally deviating and the loss from autarky. And we see that if the gain from deviating, say in pastel here, in pink, for Russia, is larger than the cost from deviating, which is the cost of tariff. And here we'll go to the extreme and impose tariffs that are infinite or autarky. You see that this gain from unilaterally deviating is much larger than the cost of tariff. And so you would know that would, in some sense, put a constraint on how much you can do in a climate agreement with one particular carbon tax, which is the one I implement here. Okay, so you see that like Middle East and Russia have a larger gain from deviating than they have a cost of autarky. So even if you impose an infinite tariff on them, they have a larger gains of unilaterally deviating that will put a constraint or participation constraint that's binding for those two countries. Okay? Okay, so hopefully this message is clear. I have a welfare decomposition that's just putting in mathematics the mechanism that I was just saying with words. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip. And here I'm going to go through the main result of this paper. Okay, so here, the optimal design of the climate agreement will balance the intensive margin and the extensive margin. Intensive margin is when you put a higher tax, you reduce emission and potentially increase welfare. However, the extensive margin is that when you're imposing a higher tax, potentially you would decrease participation. So in this graph with the different colors, I put in the x-axis the tariff rate of the club on the countries outside the club. So here would be like 20% to 60% to 100% tariff on the countries that are outside the club. And in the y-axis, I'm choosing different levels of the carbon tax. And so for this combination of these two instruments, the tariff rate and the carbon tax, I'm going to see which coalition or which set of countries is stable under those two instruments. So as I was mentioning in this section, when the carbon tax is lower, potentially the cost from deviating is much smaller. And so you can potentially accommodate a much larger coalition. In particular, you can achieve the largest coalition, which is the entire world, here in 10. So I have the 10 regions, which is the full world participation. But as soon as you increase the carbon tax, it becomes much more costly in terms of distortion, in terms of reduction of fossil fuel, reduction in fossil fuel rent. And so typically the Russian economy, the former Soviet countries, and the Middle East, when the tax increases, have an incentive to deviate and leave the climate agreement. That comes back to the trade-off between the gain from trade and the unilateral gains from deviating. And similarly, for South Asia, when the tax gets very high, some of these developing economies rely heavily on coal and are much poorer than other countries in the world. And so they really need this energy input to produce. And so they would have a large gain in deviating. And the gain from trade is much smaller for South Asia because they don't trade as much with the rest of the world. Okay, so that's the intensive and extensive margin at play here. Now, the question we want to ask is which of this coalition, which of this choice of the carbon tax and the tariff is optimal? And so here, I'm going to show you the optimal design of this climate agreement, the choice of the carbon tax and the tariff for the optimal climate agreement. And so I was mentioning before that the optimal second best tax is much lower than the social cost of carbon. That's 150, probably 160, and something smaller, which is 137 that I was showing before. Okay, and the optimal design of the climate agreement now includes the participation constraint, the incentive and extensive margin that I was showing before. And the optimal design of the climate agreement needs to reduce the carbon tax to accommodate the participation constraint of Middle Eastern countries and Maghrebian countries. And despite the full freedom of these two instruments, we see that we cannot achieve a climate agreement with the full participation of the entire world with the tax at the level of the second best world optimal tax. And so in particular, we need to reduce the carbon tax from 136 to $98 per ton of carbon to accommodate for this participation constraint. If we increase the carbon tax, we could leave some of those countries and potentially they will not impose any carbon tax, and that would increase emission and potentially damage welfare. But the optimal design of the climate agreement here does not include Russia, and the reason is that no matter what you do, the Russian economy or other former Soviet countries are relatively cold and they are relatively close. They don't trade that much with the rest of the world, and they are, in particular, they are fossil fuel producer. And so they don't want to impose a carbon tax that would dry out the rent of their fossil fuel production or extraction firm. Okay, so if you want to include Russia, you will need to lower the tax to a much lower level, which here would reduce the intensive margin and of course would not solve climate change as much as you would like to. Okay, and the reason why we choose that particular climate agreement is because here I'm showing the same picture, but instead of showing the stable clubs, I'm showing welfare, which is here in percent deviation in consumption equivalent from the competitive equilibrium. And you see that when the carbon tax is much lower, you don't gain anything from that. But when you increase the carbon tax, you increase welfare, you solve climate change, and potentially you would also change and affect the participation constraint of different countries. And so here you see very well the borders of different regions where you change coalition and the agreement is not stable anymore. And so that's why here we would like to maximize welfare, impose a large tariff to include all of these countries inside the climate agreement, increase carbon tax as much as possible to reduce emissions, but in the same time leave the Russian economy out because they don't have any incentive to join the climate agreements. Okay, and so here you can recover most of the welfare gain from the second best allocation. Okay, so here I have, in the last 2 minutes, I'm just going to show you that in this context, reduction in carbon emission and welfare are two different measures. They are not the same in a large class of integrated assessment model. It's not, reduction in emission is not the only metric that you need to care about to maximize welfare. So I was mentioning that the optimal climate agreement with tariff recover 90% of the welfare gain from the first best. But the problem with that agreement is that I was mentioning, we are reducing the carbon tax. We are going from 136 to $98 per ton of carbon. And that has a cost, it increases emission by 13%. And so here in these different bars, I'm showing the different allocation, the first best, the second best without transfers, and the optimal agreement. And you see that accommodating for this participation constraint forces you to give up a bit on the reduction in emission. And so the CO2 emission per year is larger in the optimal agreement than in the second best. However, now let's do a thought experiment and do a case where you're imposing a carbon tax to be equal to the social cost of carbon at the cost of lowering of leaving having some country leave the agreement, say the Middle East, Russia, and South Asia, the countries I was showing before. Sure, you would reduce the carbon emission of the countries that are inside the climate agreement, but you will lose on welfare because now you would impose a tariff on them, and the countries inside the climate agreement has to bear a larger cost of carbon emission reduction, and that would potentially be bad for welfare. And so you would like to do this intensive margin trade-off and include more countries to spread the cost of climate change across more countries and potentially recover some of the welfare gain from the second best. Okay, I have other extensions that I'm not going to cover, the loss and damage fund that are a policy proposal, and a tax on fossil fuel energy input that are some other interesting discussion about trade policy, and also some kind of discussion about dynamic coalition formation. This is all extension. We're very happy to talk about this offline or later. I'm going to conclude. So in this project, I'm solving the optimal design of the climate agreement. We need to solve both for inequality and redistributive effect of the carbon taxation through energy market and trade leakage, as well as free riding incentive. You need to account for this participation constraint, and the climate agreement needs to jointly solve for this different aspect, both on the policy and on the participation free riding aspect. Okay, so when you have access to these instruments, you see that the optimal coalition depends on this trade-off between the gain from cooperation or the cost from free riding, the gain from free riding or unilateral deviating, and the gain from trade or the cost of retaliatory tariff. And with a large coalition, you need an extensive coalition to have most of the countries in the world to be able to reduce emission meaningfully and to recover most of the welfare gain, but at the cost of reducing the carbon tax slightly lower than the second best optimal. I was mentioning the extension, but happy to talk about that more offline. And thank you so much for your attention, and hopefully, interesting discussion later.
Great, thanks so much, Thomas. Now I'll open the floor up to questions. So if you'd like me to read out your question, just post it in the Q&A window. If you'd like to speak up yourself, please use the raise hand function and we can unmute you. While people gather their questions, I might ask one. I'm just thinking more about the dynamic settings that you've got as an extension there.
Yeah.
From a little bit of a different angle, I mean, in what sense should we think about solving this statically, given that the technology parameters are changing all the time? So, renewables get cheaper in kind of predictable ways. Should we think about this as just a steady state to steady state comparison and I can solve both? Or do we really need to think about the plan for the future going forward?
That's an excellent question, and that's exactly what I have in mind when I'm thinking about the dynamics here. So the dynamics would be both in terms of the trade-off of the energy transition. So you were mentioning like the lowering of the cost of renewable, but also like the growth trajectories of population and TFP of these different countries. And we very well know that some of the emerging economies are growing much faster than Western economies, and typically we reallocate some of this economic activity across different countries. So that's the thing that I have in mind when I'm thinking about the dynamics. Is it valuable to join a climate agreement today, or to join in like 50 years or 100 years when like energy becomes cheaper, or growth become larger for some of these emerging economies? I have that in mind. I didn't implement this extension yet. It's still very much work in progress, or even maybe for in a couple of months, or because this becomes a dynamic game along with this dynamic path of all the economic variable that you think about. But I was mentioning this companion paper here, that where I'm looking at this optimal taxation in the first and second best, accounting for dynamics. And there I have exogenous participation, but I have dynamics. So I don't have this climate club consideration, but I have the full path of social cost of carbon, cost of energy, and I have exactly that in this paper, where I'm reducing for now exogenously the costs of renewable energy, and that potentially change this demand distortion, and that would potentially change dynamically the level of the carbon tax. So
Right.
that consideration is very very much present in this paper. I don't have that right now. I agree with you. Like, considering a static problem is a limitation, but that's what I have for now, and definitely something I have in mind as a macroeconomist to include that in the paper in the future.
Great stuff. Okay, now we've got a question for Yasmin. Yasmin, you can go
Yes.
ahead and
Thank you.
unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. Very interesting work. So I have a question actually about the state of the economy or welfare under the optimal climate agreement versus second best. Because when I looked at your graph, I think if we looked at emissions, what we see, and I don't know like relative to which point in time this is, that
Yes.
we go just over the 6,000, right? Which is the remaining carbon budget in the case of the optimal climate agreement, but we do not under first best and second best. So I was actually wondering whether I should view the 6,000 here as the remaining carbon budget. I think that was
No, sorry. Yeah, I was not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so very, very great point. Thank you so much for your question. So here, like, the CO2 emission is like the CO2 emission per year.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
this is the yearly emission in each of these contexts. So here in the first best, because you have access to all the instruments, you potentially do a very high carbon tax, and then you do redistribution across country with transfers.
Yeah.
In the second best, you don't have transfers, so you're limited in the kind of welfare level that you can achieve, and because of that, you need to reduce the carbon tax. By reducing the carbon tax, of course, you increase carbon emission per year, so you go from 5,500 to close to 6,000. But with the optimal agreement, you're forced to accommodate this participation constraint. You need to reduce the level of the carbon tax to include this participation, and at the cost of increasing by 13% again the emission per year. So I don't know exactly how it would map into the budget, but I do this calculation for you.
It might be interesting to look at it. So for example, when I saw the graph, I was like, whoa, we kind of just go above the budget, but then the welfare costs are like half a percentage point. So that's why. So,
yeah, right, exactly.
And so I, by the way, also know a paper which also looks at the optimal carbon tax in the presence of redistributive considerations and inequality. It takes more of a heterogeneous agent approach, but it might be nice to have a look at the paper. So I'll send the link in the chat.
Is it the paper by Elisa Del Fiori?
No, it is from Duen, Fabre, and Hummel. I'll send the link.
I know them. I
actually
met them, and we had discussion.
Okay.
So some of this consideration that I have here in this paper, and this first and second best, this exactly the same fundamental forces that is at play.
Exactly.
I have inequality across countries. They have inequality within countries.
Within the country,
but the mechanisms are the same, and typically you need to account for this inequality effect when you put the carbon tax. And that's why they have also like all these different. So they take a really like quantitative numerical approach, while I'll do like more theoretical result.
Yeah. Okay. Very nice. Great.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, now we have a question from Meha Sadasivam. How would the predictions of the model change if you were to include geopolitical risks or considerations, maybe particularly around Russia?
Yes, that's first order questions indeed. So typically, like the geopolitical consideration here would make the agreement even more unstable, in the sense that I was showing this picture here. So you would imagine that there's no level of carbon, say for geopolitical reason, there's no level of carbon tax that would accommodate Russia in a climate agreement as along with the US and Europe, and that could be due to geopolitical reason, and that's something that could that's work in progress. I'm including the idea that you can have like geopolitical constraint, that's say Russia and Iran never join any climate agreement for geopolitical reason, and that would potentially put a constraint on the amount of carbon mitigation that you can achieve, because they would never join. But it has a pros and cons. Now you know they will never join, so you do without them, and so because of that you can potentially increase the carbon tax for the remaining members and potentially reduce emission slightly more by going with this incentive margin, by increasing the, now you know you don't need to accommodate them participation constraint. You don't try to reduce the tax to make them enter the club, but you do without them, and with the remaining member of the club, you try to maximize the welfare and the. So in some sense, it has a double-edged sword here. And that's very much work in progress, but and that's definitely something I will include in the next iteration.
Great. I mean, as a suggestion, you might think about integrating with this new geoeconomics literature that Jesse Schrager, Chris Clayton are working on, Matteo Maggiore. You
Yes.
expand the set of instruments, obviously. You can think about financial sanctions and the like. There may be ways to get them into the club while also, accommodating their participation constraints.
Yes, that's is very much something on my mind. When I think about the dynamic problem, say when I have a dynamic coalition building, you can imagine that you have a dynamic problem here, and you can imagine that each agent in each country is like doing consumption saving, and because consumption saving, you can also borrow on international market, and then because of that, you can potentially not you can put some countries in financial autarky. That would be potentially something I have in mind.
Great. Well, I think we're right on time to wrap up. So thanks so much, Thomas, for coming along, and thanks to the audience and the panelists as well. Our next webinar is going to take place on September 30th, when we'll have Adrian Bilal from Stanford talking about his research on the macroeconomic impact of climate change, global versus local temperature. The link to the webinar is in the chat. If you've got a paper to submit for consideration, please do send it along. We'll post that link in the chat as well. And thanks so much to Thomas again. Great paper.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the questions and interesting discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for Thomas. That was great. And as I mentioned to you, I'll be in touch with you again via email, and we will post your presentation and your slides on our website in the next couple of days.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you to any of our PhD students who are still online. And thank you for your questions. I apologize to those of you that we didn't have a chance to get to, but there's always next time. Okay. Connor, thanks a lot. I'll also see you as the moderator on our next webinar.
Great. Thank you very much. See you.
Good to see
Okay,
you
everyone.
again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the questions. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.